like to move on with our first panelist, and she's here to my left. Her name is Celeste McKay, and she's a Métis woman from Manitoba. She has a Bachelor of Social Work degree from the University of Manitoba, LLB degree from the University of Victoria, and a LLM from the University of Ottawa that focused on the international right to health of Indigenous women in Canada. Her greatest source of joy is her son, Evan Raoul Chartrand. Please welcome Celeste McKay.
Thank you. To spend a few moments setting out some of the relevant provisions of the UN Declaration on the right to education and Indigenous women, and then talk about a couple of other developments. But just to start with, the Native Women's Association of Canada is founded on a collective goal to enhance, promote, and foster the social, economic, cultural, and political well-being of Aboriginal women within the Aboriginal community and Canadian society. NWAC is the national voice of Aboriginal women in Canada, incorporated in 1974 with provincial and territorial member associations across the country, and we engage in national strategies and international strategies, for that matter, aimed at legislative and policy reforms that promote equality for Aboriginal women. Much like a grandmother's lodge, we as aunties, mothers, sisters, brothers, and relatives collectively recognize, respect, promote, defend, and enhance our Indigenous ancestral laws, spiritual beliefs, languages, and traditions given to us by the Creator. So for my presentation today, like I said, I want to look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, take a brief look at the Expert Mechanisms Report on the Right to Education, and also the Forum on Minority Issues Report and the Advisory Committee of the Human Rights Council's report on the right to human rights education. In relation to the UN Declaration, there are 3 articles that specifically mention Indigenous women. Articles 21, 22, and 44. And these articles should be referred to alongside of the articles specific to the right to education. Article 21 talks about Indigenous peoples having the right without discrimination to the improvement of their economic and social conditions, including in the areas of education, employment, vocational training and retraining, housing, sanitation, health, and social security. And then Article 21, Sub 2 talks about taking special measures for the continuing improvement of economic and social conditions, including the right to education. And in particular, what measures need to be taken to meet the special needs and rights of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities. And then when we look at the specific provisions on the right to education, these are Articles 2, 12 Sub 1, 13, 14, 15, 17 Sub 2, and 44. And I'm taking, this is referred to specifically in the Expert Mechanisms Report as well. So Article 2 is the right to non-discrimination. Article 12.1 is the right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach Indigenous peoples' spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies. Article 13 talks about transmitting to future generations the histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures. And we saw great example of that just a few moments ago. And then the right to establish and control educational systems and institutions in Indigenous languages and cultural methodologies is Article 14, Sub 1 of the UN Declaration. So that's really talking about Indigenous peoples as nations or, having those rights. And then also under 14, Sub 2 and 3, it talks about the right of children to non-discrimination in education, in their own languages, and through culturally specific methodologies. Sorry, I'm having technical trouble here. Then Article 15, the right to dignity and cultural, traditional, historical diversity reflected in education and public information without discrimination. And again, under Article 17.2, it protects the right to special measures to be taken to ensure Indigenous children are protected from economic exploitation, child labor practices that could interfere with their right to education. So when we look at the expert mechanism report, there are 2 paragraphs specifically on Indigenous women at paragraphs 96 and 97. The first paragraph talks about barriers to education for girls and women, such as prioritization of domestic duties and early marriage over education for girls, and the need for special measures to ensure that discriminatory practices like this, like making girls stay home to take care of the house instead of having their education, be overcome and equal access obtained. And it also talks about instruments of dialogue to mediate internal conflicts among Indigenous, within Indigenous communities. And I think there's a real role for Indigenous women to play there in regaining or bringing back cultural practices where they were the transmitters of traditional knowledge. And sometimes those have been lost and sometimes they haven't. So.